Welcome back into the studio, and I've been asked by a lot of my Patreon members to tackle dog's fur. And quite a few of those members wanted me to tackle either white or dark fur, so this is the dark to start with. And I've also picked something very, very complicated. So I've got a photograph of a poodle, and as you can see, the ear has got lots of waviness, dark areas, light areas. So this is the final drawing that I did, and it actually took me around about 1.5 hours to complete. And I mention the time because what people have got to take into consideration when they're starting a drawing is how much effort and time they're willing to put into a piece. So as you can see, I really detailed up this section for 1.5 hours on that. So you can imagine the whole head, you know, would probably have been another 3-4 hours. This is the most difficult part, so that's why that would have taken a lot longer. Some areas would have been much quicker to actually do. The idea of this bit of a workshop is not to do a whole subject, but to rather concentrate on little areas from various subjects so that I can jump around a bit and actually show different breeds as well, rather than just make one long 3-hour video or something just showing one breed. Now I've used brown pastel matte paper, could have used dark grey as well, but I like that mid-tone. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know the reasoning behind that. I've transferred my drawing over first with transfer paper, and then I've put in the dark areas, the dark lines, with a black or a dark brown pastel pencil. So now you've seen what the finished area will look like. Let's take a look and see exactly how I achieved it. As you can see, I've got my reference photo right by that area on the right of the pastel mat, just so you can really see side by side what I'm doing. Almost out of view on the far left is some pan pastels, and I'm going to use those and some soft sticks as well, and I'll tell you why I'll be using those a little bit later on. But the first thing I'm doing is actually indicating where the highlights are going to be. Now because this fur is so haphazard almost, we've got all those ringlets of fur on there, lots of highlights, and a big contrast difference between the lightest highlight and the darkest darks. Now what that means is if I went over this all with say the mid-tone, which is a fairly dark brown over the whole area, I could well struggle to get the highlights to sit on top of it, because they would get muddy, because as I said, there's quite a large difference between the highlight and the middle tone. If there wasn't much of a difference, I could go in with the middle tone over all of it and then put in the darks and then the highlights. And you've seen me do that on lots of my videos. But this one I picked, or a member actually picked this on Patreon, and then I selected this as well because it shows a very, very difficult subject, especially if you want to create the realism. Now when you're doing pet portraits, it's a bit different than wildlife portraits, because the owner, you know, has got obviously real intimate knowledge of exactly how the pet looks, so they're going to be usually hypercritical over it as well. They've usually supplied the photograph, so that means more often than not they're going to be looking at the photograph and comparing it against the artwork. So those are things to take into consideration. I wanted to make this very realistic as well. If you want it more impressionistic, obviously you would stop at an earlier stage. So that's why I've really pushed the boundaries of realism on this and put in, as you'll see at the end, lots and lots of small fine hairs as well. Now I put in those highlights, and now I'm putting in some of the darks. Now that's just a black pastel pencil. The reason I'm putting in the darks is because, you know, if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll hear me say that I'm not following every little loop or every little wave of fur. I'm getting the essence. With this, I'm trying to follow it a little bit more accurately than I normally would, because it's a pet portrait. So I need to break down this really complicated, the real complicated shapes and forms. I need to find my way and build that map. Remember, I always talk about these underlayers being maps. In this case, I want to try and get the accuracy of these waves, these ringlets of haze, so that I'm not just drawing blindly and putting them any which way. Now, as the shapes are so complicated, I need to give myself the best chance of getting it right and getting it fairly accurate. So that's why I put the darks in, that's why I'm putting the lights in. Just got a bit of a kind of a raw sienna from the Carbofello range, just colouring up as well, because you can see on that reference photo there's lots of richness going to be, especially in the highlight areas. So more than probably most of my subjects, I'm really going to attack this drawing, this particular drawing, really cautiously, really slowly, step by step. If I get areas that are too dark under the highlights, I'm not going to get this richness back, and vice versa. If I put areas that are too light in those really dark recesses in between the curls and fur, I'm not going to get that dark back easily either. Now I'm going to quite carefully use my pan pastels. So I've got a couple of browns on there. I've just got some printer paper at the bottom that I'm using kind of as a mixing palette, and I'm going to quite carefully start to block in, you know, the mid-tone colours that I'm seeing. Now what you'll find, and it's another reason I picked this subject from that Patreon member, I thought it'd be a good idea, is because browns are a really difficult colour to do with pastels, especially very dark browns. Now the reason I say that is I've got 5-6 different sets of pastel pencils, and pretty much none of them has got a dark rich brown as dark and rich as is on that reference photo. So what that means is if you're just using pencils, you're going to struggle to get that high degree of contrast, to get the rich dark browns. You've got, obviously with your pencils, you've got black, you know, that's really, really dark. But then there's a massive jump up from black to the darkest brown. It's nowhere near black at all. So at this stage, I'm just getting a mid-tone in. I could have used pencils for this if I wanted to. Lots of people like to see me use pan pastels as well, so that's why I thought I'd use that. But when we start on the darkest browns, you're going to see me use pastel sticks. And the reason I'll use those is because we've got a wider range of colours, and especially of tones, so the lightness to darkness. So those sticks are going to be punchier. I've got more of a chance of getting a dark, rich brown rather than what you get in pencils, which is more of a dark, dead brown. So it's particularly useful if you've built up a lovely set of pastel pencils to also look at especially the dark, rich browns, because they really come up a lot when you're doing wildlife and when you're doing pet portraits. So I'm just going to carry on now. As you can see, I'm doing a middle kind of tone with pan pastels. I'm not putting much on there, and I'm trying to stay away from those ringlet highlights as well. Now after I put the pan pastels down, I usually like to rub it in with my fingers. As you can see, there's virtually no dust at all on that paper surface. Now here I'm going in with some of those dark sticks. So this is a Jackson's soft pastel, although they're not particularly soft, but don't go pushing hard. The pastel comes from these sticks very, very easily, and it's also then, as you can imagine, easy to fill the tooth of the paper. So you can see I'm barely putting weight on it. Then I'm blending it in, but look how much darker and how richer that colour is. So I'm going to use it now to put in those rich dark areas, You can see I'm trying to avoid as much as I can the highlight areas. I know I can put highlights on top of this after I've rubbed it in, but I still want to be very cautious where I'm putting in these real dark browns. Now you see I'm working my way down, not worrying too much about all those highlights. Remember, with pastels we can put lights on top of darks, and I'm not going to do an area much more than this because it's pointless me doing the rest of the ear because it's just going to be duplicating the technique you're going to see me performing on this video. So that's why with this dog demonstration class I'm only going to do small areas. I figured you'd get more out of it doing it that way. Now once again using my finger. Now with pastel matte paper, remember it grabs hold of the pastel really well. So I'm just creating a darker general colour, and see I can even go over the light areas and it's not obliterating at all. I can still see the shape of the highlight areas, but there's not much pastel down there, and that means I'm going to be able to get the highlights on there no problem at all, and all of a sudden I've got that map now that I can follow. I'm just using another stick to add some of this rich colour in some various places. Now we're going to be doing lots and lots of layers, but we've got to start somewhere, and we're starting with a thin base. Now very slowly I'm going to start adding in some darks and a few indications of the lights as well. I don't want to lose that bit of work I did underneath. I can still see those ringlets of hair coming down. If I'd put any more of that base layer on I would have lost them, but I've still got the general shape and form of the major shapes, so I want to keep those. Got a few pencils in my hand. I've got a couple of dark browns, a grey, and you can see this black as well, and that's what I'm going to use now to elaborate on the shapes that I'm seeing without losing anything. So you can see I'm re-establishing where that highlight's going to go, where the next highlight's going to go. See that comes around here a bit, but very cautiously. I'm not pushing hard with the pencil, because when we're depositing only a small amount of pastel, that means we can go on top with more layers. If I start pushing really hard, I'm going to fill the tooth of the paper up, and then I'm not going to be able to make the corrections and the refinement that I know I'm going to need on the next layer. So you can see I've got that curl coming around there. I'm just touching it, just bedding it into the paper, and then down here we've got highlights that's going to happen as well, starting with the major parts, the major shapes and forms, and then I'll refine it more. Now remember, the camera is shooting from left to right, so I'm staying out of shot. Both images on the left and the right are actually identical size. I said I transferred that drawing over, so I've traced that drawing over. So what you're seeing is obviously distortion from that camera angle. So you can see how I'm just indicating where these shapes are going to go. So we started off with the major block of colour, and now I'm doing the very first stages of indicating the hair direction, the fur direction. And all I'm going to do now for this first part is just carry on doing that, and then where there's real dark elements, that's where I'm going to use my black pastel pencil. No real highlights going on yet. Now to give this some punch, I need those real darks in there, and you're not going to get those darks with a pastel pencil, even a black pastel pencil. I'm using a pastel stick that I've sharpened to a point. This is a new pastel, NU pastel stick, and you can see how much darker it is. And it's essential to get those darks in place, or the midtones are going to look dark. Then the lights won't look dark enough, or sorry, the highlights won't look light enough. So you need the full range of tonal range. So I need to get the real darks, as you can see in the reference photo. I need to get them really black. That way the mid-tone brown will look mid-tone. If the really dark blacks is not dark enough, then all of a sudden it starts to get very similar in tone to the mid-tone. So you don't have that color range or that tonal range, and then when I put the highlights on, they don't look as bright as they should do. So the new pastel stick, I find, is nice and hard. You could also use other brands as well. You've got the Faber-Castell sticks, they're roughly the same size, and you can sharpen them too. But I wouldn't be using something like a you know, a really big soft pastel. You won't get the accuracy that you need out of those. They're very difficult to use. So you can see now I'm putting the blacks in, all of a sudden the mid-tone browns are looking like mid-tone, but before I put the blacks in, they was acting as the darks. So I'm just lightly rubbing that in place, and you see it's taken now all of it down in colour and tone. And now I'll start again to come back in with the pencils and start to lighten everything up as I begin to add, you know, the real first bit of proper refinement with sharper pencils. And I need to come back in with the darks and then the lights, as you'll see in the rest of this video. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm really creeping up cautiously on the highlights with this, putting as little pastel down as I can, but trying to work out where those shapes are. It's really, really complicated how all of those ringlets of fur hair is going in different directions and picking up different areas of highlight along the way. And that's the main reason I'd like to get that reference photo really close. Now, if you're working from a screen, a tablet, it's that bit difficult again. So sometimes I work from a tablet, more often than not it's a printout, but sometimes I work from a tablet in general. If I start to struggle with an area, I do a printout of that area just so I can get it really, really close and even, as you've seen probably on other videos where I fold the paper and offer it right up next to the area I'm working on. So I'm just going to carry on now for the next 5 or 10 minutes, putting in the basic underlying shapes. I'll start adding more realistic colours later on. Now I'm using a Rembrandt pencil. So this is dark and darker than a normal pastel pencil, but the actual nib of it is extremely fragile and brittle, so they break very, very often, and I don't use it often at all unless I need a little bit more refinement and something extremely black. So I could have come back in with my new pastel, sharpened up a bit more perhaps, had this pencil at hand, so I thought I'd use that just to really re-establish and punch up those blacks yet again, because they are essential on this particular portrait. So if you wanted to buy this particular pencil, it's actually on the shaft of the pencil is Rembrandt Black Pastel, Lyra, Germany. Okay, so for those that want to get that exact one. I don't want to put too much of it down. It is powerful, it's a bit dusty, but it is extremely black. So carrying on now to go that little bit lighter. So I'm using one of the darker Pitt pastel pencils, sharpened up well, and it doesn't look like I'm doing much at all, but I'm laying in the groundwork, the underlayer, the base details. You can't jump in with all the fine details too quickly, because then you won't have depth at all in the area. It'll just look like you've put one layer on top of the underlayer. You can see on the reference that there's lots of depth in this fur. There's lots of deep dark areas come into the light areas. The light areas have got to be put on last. Now I wouldn't go much smaller than this. The dog's head from left to right, the width of it is around about 11 inches. So I asked a question on my Patreon channel what size pet portraits most people are doing, and they usually work in smaller than this. Now you can see how much I've got that pencil sharpened. Pastel pencils really don't go much sharper than that at all unless you're sharpening them every couple of strokes. I don't want to be doing that. It takes a lot of time. So if you want a high degree of fine haze, as I'm doing now, then you need to work quite large. I won't go much below that 11-inch width. On a dog portrait, if you want to put the tiny haze in place. The smaller you go in, the thicker your hair marks are going to be from the pencil. So it's all going to look a little bit unrealistic. It's going to look like, you know, the hairs are really thick on there. So it depends on the subject. It depends on the level of detail you want to put on. So if you were working much more impressionistic, you'd be working and looking just at the ringlets, whereas I'm really trying to look at the finer hairs as well. So always keep that in mind. And the way to look to see if you can get the level of realism, print a small section out, the size you're going to draw it, look at the tip of your pencil, a sharpened pencil, and see if it'll make that fine hair mark. If it won't, you know you either need to go and leave some of that detail out, or you need to go larger again. Pastel is quicker to do than colored pencils, so if you're earning a living out of it, or you want to be a pet portrait artist, with pastels we can generally go for a larger, more impressive looking sized portrait than you normally would with colored pencil, and do it in roughly the same amount of time or even less. So I'm just going to carry on now with this grey pencil, starting to add a few of the, you know, barely lighter details. So I'm happy with that as, you know, kind of an underlayer. Now I'm going to start to push a bit harder with the pencil. I'm selecting lighter pencils as well. And I'm going to work my way down top to bottom and start to really begin to add more of the detail and more of the highlights. Still in a very slow manner. Now there's not a great deal for me to say on the voiceover, but I'm generally putting in the lights and then toning them with the brown, because I don't have a colour that's that light and that brown without it going kind of really yellowy or really red. So sometimes you've got to, you know, select your colour, the grey for the brightness, and then just gently tone it with another colour on top. So I'm just going to let the video run real time, because I know lots of people want to see a lot of the video in real time. You've got that option then to fast forward or skip through if you want, but you've also got the option to watch it real time. As you can see, I'm working on each small area at a time. There's nothing you can really do to speed this up. Now, I asked on my Patreon channel when I showed them the finished section how long they thought I took to do that. They know that I'm usually quite a fast drawer and a fast painter, and I had times ranging from around about 30 minutes to 3 hours. But you can see there's no big shortcut for this. It's not just flowing from the pencil and drawing itself, so to speak. You've got to look at each little area and do it very slowly and with multiple layers to really start to build up the realism. So that's starting to come along a bit now. Whenever you want to soften an area, you can always just gently go over it with your finger, or even very lightly with a pencil or another colour to kind of, loosely, gently blend it in. You can see when I want a more pronounced area, I'm just pushing that bit harder, always twirling that pencil around every couple of strokes. Helps to keep the point on there lasting longer. And just generally working my way down on that paper. Now what you'll find is when you're doing something like this is the darks, all of a sudden they seem to not be as punchy and they've got lost, they've been blended in a bit. So every now and again I'm still coming back in, punching up the darks, and you can see as soon as I do that, the three-dimensional look to it increases because I've got that large tonal range. We need to keep the darks, those recesses, really dark on this particular drawing. Otherwise the mid-tones, it all looks kind of like a middle tone mess. It doesn't have any punch to it. So that's why you see me keep coming back in with this really dark pencil. Now over halfway through the drawing, really starting to come back in with more refinement using this flesh coloured pit pencil. Nice and sharp again. So I'm really coming over it all now with another layer. And each layer, as you can see, is getting more detailed and more refined. It's got more finesse to it. So the issue with a subject like this is there's lots of little tiny hairs in there. You can't really pick them up all that well on a video camera because, you know, the quality is not really there. But I'm putting lots of little tiny hairs. I'm trying to keep the shape and the ringlets of the hair as well. As I say, it's not an easy subject at all, but that's what you're going to get when you get pet portraits. They're not all going to be short-haired, one-coloured pets. You're going to get lots of complicated hair and fur as well. Now I'm coming in lighter and lighter all the time. So that's my general way of working. You may probably have seen on other videos. With pastels, we are usually working dark to light, but you can see as well that I've still got plenty of tooth on the paper because I didn't go put in something really dark under these light areas. So I've reserved some of the tooth doing it the way that I did. And once again, I let the video go real time. And you can just see how I'll build up this next layer of lighter work. As I'm coming down, you can see that I'm sometimes using this brown pencil. Once again, this is a pit pencil, and that's colouring over the top, remember, of the lighter layer. It's softening it a bit as well, using a very, very light stroke. If I want to soften it more, I can even touch it with my finger, as you just saw. Really is a process of gradually getting lighter and lighter. And now you can see, we're probably way over an hour into the drawing, how it's starting to look more realistic. It doesn't have to be identical to the reference photo. If I wanted it identical, or as identical as I could get it, I'd have to spend probably another hour as well, and that all of a sudden is going to turn, if I did the full portrait, probably turn it into a 15 hours on just the head. Up to a certain level will generally be good enough. If people wanted their pet done photo or hyper realistic like that, they probably would have just stuck with the photograph itself. So we've got a bit of creativity and painterly look built into it. But as I mentioned at the start, I wanted to show you, if I added a lot of detail, how I would have approached it, how I would have tackled it. Now once again I can see there's areas that need to go that bit darker, so I could have come in with the new pastel stick, or I've got more control again with this Rembrandt pencil, and you can see I can use that then to soften areas, to send areas into shadow. That's all adding to that shape. Remember, this is a three-dimensional subject we're trying to create, so it's not evenly lit by the sun. Areas that are going into deep shadow, deeper into the fur. That's what I'm actually looking at creating now. And you see all of a sudden then the shape, that three-dimensional look is building even more. So I'm being very gentle as I do it, refining. It's all about the refinement. Now really starting to come in with the highlights. Sharp, sharp pencil. That's just about as sharp as I'll get my pastels. This is that icing on the cake. This is the little elements of haze, straggler haze going here and everywhere. Then I can come back in and start to colour up this section with a light layer of pencil again. So you can see how that light layer just adds that richness to it. and it's starting to look not too far off the reference. It's not identical, but it's got that look that if you felt you could touch the drawing, you know, you'd feel that, yeah, this is how it would feel. It'd be kind of soft wavy fur coming down, and that's what you're after, trying to capture that essence. Now I'm actually using a really highly sharpened coloured pencil now, just for a few of these very fine hairs. Now a coloured pencil would go sharper than a pastel pencil. I don't mix the two up very much at all, but you can see it does add another element of detail. Okay, so as I add the last few strokes, hope you've enjoyed this really complicated poodle fur. Hope it was giving you an idea of how much work goes into it when you've got that much detail, and also how to tackle it with layer upon layer. So I'll see you all again on the next video.